Hello and welcome to our latest edition of the Inside Line, a 2-episode podcast dose for you guys. Today of the Inside Line, we just finished taping up our episode detailing all of the silly season machinations over the last 48 hours. Encourage you guys to give that a listen if you haven't already. But here on this episode, we will go through the IndyCar season finale at Nashville Superspeedway, won by Josef Newgarden, Team Penske's second race win in 3 weekends, a first win of the year for Josef Newgarden. He continues his streak of at least one race a year since 2015. We'll talk a lot about his breakthrough win, ultimately what led to that, with some bad luck or some unfortunate ends to some days for guys who were right up around or at the front of this race that created a really compelling series of battles until that final lap of 225. We'll also discuss the way in which this championship panned out, how the leader circle battle finally finished up, who ended up with your Rookie of the Year honors, and why that came quite literally down to the final 10 laps of this race. And then at the end, we will touch on the 2026 IndyCar schedule and where that currently stands. Again, as of 12:42 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, still not yet formally announced or confirmed, but we're continuing to learn some more news about how that is shaping up. We got news this week of what that new race in the Greater Toronto area will look like, not only next year, but for the next 5 years. So we will touch on all of that. And to break all of that down with me, my co-host, Joey Barnes. Joey, we've finally gotten to the end of this 2025 IndyCar season that did not disappoint. It was a very unique one ultimately dominated by Alex Palou, but not short on storylines to discuss here, even in the series finale where the championship had been wrapped up for a couple of weeks.
For as slow of a burn as the opening part of this year was, man, we got here in a hurry once we hit summer. Huh? I mean, I was kind of just reflecting on it yesterday, as a matter of fact, of just like, wow, it's already September. We're already right here. The season's over. Checkered flag has fallen on 2025. And, I mean, we were wondering, is Josef Newgarden going to go winless? And, is that streak going to end of 9 straight winning seasons? And, he was able to keep it together and make it 10. And so he's got, I think, the second longest active streak in the series, behind only Scott Dixon, who's at 21 right now.
Yeah. Actually, it had been 10 and he made it 11.
Oh, sorry, 10 to 11.
Yeah.
So yeah, big difference, obviously, to hit the double digits, but or to rise in the double digits more. But it was a unique race. I thought it was a fantastic race from, I'd say, start to almost finish. After seeing how thrilling the beginning and middle and really 2/3 of that race was, it kind of was a little flat after that last caution. I thought maybe it could have had I thought the race deserved more. Even if the results were the same, I just thought, we got to about 20 to go in that race, and Scott McLaughlin was leading and just got a little bit high, grazed the wall, which allowed Josef to sneak by from P2 to take the lead. And just the slight wall graze, we get a caution, and it sets up a scenario where it's, Josef Newgarden versus McLaughlin versus Alex Palou, who really was the dominant car. Once again, him and Pato O'Ward both were probably the standard bearers for this race up until certain miscues kind of played into the effect. So, and then from there, we thought maybe there's a situation where Scotty and Josef are tingling for this win and going for it. But I mean, Josef had a solid restart there. And, you could see a little bit of maybe timidness just with the car's attitude from Scotty Mack, trying to feel out that car a little bit from the contact with the wall. And it was enough to allow Palou to get by, but really no pressure could be applied to Josef there at the end, but kind of in a unique way, and in a way that I kind of wondered if it was going to play out this way. An absolute miserable season for Josef Newgarden. gets a little bit of a silver lining in the fact that he gets the hometown win in Nashville.
Yeah. Speaking to Josef after the race, he said a couple times he didn't necessarily feel like winning this race did anything to change the way in which he will ultimately look back and reflect on this year. He felt like this was the same team that was executing, that had speed, a driver that had great racecraft, just like we saw in both races at Iowa, and ultimately a race at Milwaukee, where until that final caution, he was in position to, he I don't think he quite had the car at Milwaukee to contend for a win. Ultimately, that was Alex Palou's race to lose, and the way in which that final caution came out. Yes, hindsight is 2020. If Josef takes new tires, what does that, and Alex Palou doesn't, what does that mean? Is he ultimately the guy in position to potentially race his way up and overtake Alex? So we can wonder about that, but this had all the feelings of a race that maybe makes up for in some way one or two of the races at Iowa that Josef felt like he should have won and probably deserved to win at least one of those and didn't. He wasn't the driver that dominated this race. That, in the early stages, we saw Alex Palou and Pato O'Ward have some real awesome side-by-side racing for lap upon lap upon lap. And ultimately it was Pato who took hold of the lead. He was the pole sitter coming into Sunday afternoon, and he goes and leads this race for a really large chunk of it. And it had the feeling up until when he blows a tire just short of this race's halfway mark of a race where Pato O'Ward was going to kind of run away with this. The kind of like how we felt like the race in Milwaukee was headed toward. It felt like a race where Pato was going to go and build a 5 or 6 second lead. And yes, you expect that there's probably going to be a caution that is going to erase it. But I felt like for a long time, that was one of those races where unless we get some sort of a real weird, quirky ending to the race, like we did at Milwaukee, where a bunch of drivers get the opportunity to not really lose anything and throw on new tires and ultimately drive up to and drive right past Alex Palou like Christian Rasmussen did, this felt like Pato O'Ward's race. And then he blows a tire, a right front, the same right front that Alex Palou also had cut. Don't know necessarily if they had the same issue, but a situation that ultimately ended Pato O'Ward's day. You had other front-running drivers like Christian Lundgaard ended his day with a mechanical issue. Drivers like Colton Herta and Will Power, who ironic talking about it now, given what has happened to them over the last 48 hours or so, and the way in which their futures are interconnected. But they both had pit lane violations that ultimately set their days back. I think Santino Ferrucci had a pit lane infraction. David Malukas crashes out from second place. Scott McLaughlin, as you mentioned, had an issue while he was running at the front, brushing the wall, and we had this group of drivers that I don't want to say gave away the race, but there were just ways in which this played out, whether it was bad luck or mistakes that ultimately ended so many drivers' days. And then what you might argue the unluckiest driver of the season in Josef Newgarden is left here at the front, holding on to the lead, and was a lead that he was definitely not going to give up on. Ultimately, he gets his first win of the year.
Yeah, and I misspoke a minute ago. I mentioned that Palou was one of the dominant cars. He was near the front throughout the entire day, so it's not fair to say that he was dominant car. Pato, obviously, very dominant with 116 laps led. Surprisingly, Josef had 60 laps led on the day, and Alexander Rossi, through changing up strategy, ended up leading 16 laps. But, Palou only 11 laps, but certainly the recovery from the cut tire and just constantly lurking in the top 5, right? And that's kind of unique in the fact that, well, it's not unique in the fact that he's always lurking. But it is this year, considering that he seems to always be leading to the point that it's dizzying. And now I just have nightmares about Alex Palou leading at the front in every single race now. But, this race was kind of unique in the respects that you look at it, and I agree with you. It wasn't necessarily so much that people were like intentionally giving this thing away. It's just there are certain circumstances that continue to happen that altered the way this race really played out. I mean, the early stages, you had, Pato and Palou and Malukas and Herta and Power really charging there for a minute and looking like he was going to go and go on a tear and really upset the apple cart before the pit road miscue. But, you look at this rundown, Newgarden first, Palou second, McLaughlin third, but a shout out to Kiffin Simpson and Connor Daly.
Mm-hmm.
Kiffin Simpson and Scott McLaughlin. Oh my gosh. The end of that race. I wish that was for the win, honestly, because you talk about inches from each other. Those two were teammates in LMP2 a few years back and won Sebring together. So to see those two fighting side by side, not giving each other an inch, leaning on each other quite a bit, absolute blast to see. That is IndyCar personified at its absolute quintessential finest. And frankly, for me, that was a growth moment for somebody like Kiffin Simpson, someone who has shown a lot of growth in his second year in the series and didn't really know what we were getting with him because of how last year played out. But man, like whatever they've hit on, they're executing at an incredibly high level. And he just continues to just chip away and get better. And, obviously it puts on some different expectations going into next year. We didn't really have many for him going into this year, but as the year's gone on, he's definitely leveled that off. And then, you look at this with Kyle Kirkwood and Felix Rosenquist and Ferrucci and Callum Ilott and Rossi, that's your 6 through 10. There's so much of this that, like, those are solid results for everyone. I look at this and I can't help but think the one guy outside of Pato, though, and this is probably a situation where you could say there's some accountability in that being put in a tough situation, but also probably putting yourself in a situation you didn't need to be in the first place. And that's David Malukas. David Malukas, there's a few instances, and we highlighted what's potentially to come in our last episode, talking about the silly season stuff that I would encourage everyone to take a listen to. So I'm not going to get too deep in the weeds on that, but I will say that some of what I saw on Sunday is part of where my hesitation lies in if he eventually grows into the Penske role to replace Will Power over there. And that's the fact that, like, at the start of this race, we saw him not get a great start, starting P2 alongside pole sitter Pato O'Ward. And then he just kind of drifts down. Christian Lundgaard's third. He's already on the inside. If Christian Lundgaard doesn't take two, go below the yellow line, that ends horribly for a lot of people. I thought that was a little bit of a brain gaffe, and it was kind of weird that race control, or it was being talked about on TV that race control might look at penalizing Christian Lundgaard for that when you got nowhere to go. And also, in what world? I've never heard the yellow line rule actually be a thing in IndyCar up until that. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of unique. And then later in the race, he's running P2, kind of taps the wall with the right rear. When he was running by himself, it just kind of unaided, just kind of seemed a little weird. And then a few laps later, he finds himself in a mix-up with lap-down car rookie Louis Foster. And this is kind of where it gets a little interesting, is the fact that he gets past Foster, but Foster kind of makes a subtle move to get back by, and they were already racing pretty close before that moment. And it's almost like, oh, I finally got by. That is kind of how the lunge effect, if you will, is kind of how it looked. But Louis brought it back, made a little bit of a slight right to change the apex going into one. Otherwise, he would have to get completely out of the throttle. And I know Louis took a lot of the blame there, or a lot of people looked at Louis. I don't necessarily want to say that Louis took the blame because I don't know. I'm not going to speak for him, but a lot of people blamed Louis in that situation. And what I'll say is this: he's a lap down car. Should he have been racing a lead lap car?
And I think the important way to term that, and I think this is right. If I'm wrong, I apologize. But he was lap down to the leader, but he was not a lap down to the entire field. Now, I know IndyCar's rules are different on the blue flag stuff for ovals and how that. I don't think they necessarily have that whole you have to be a lap down to the entire field before you have to get over. But there certainly is something to that. As you mentioned, David is running second at the time. And at minimum, Louis has been lapped by Pato Ward at the moment. And so it's, I don't know that he was like 2, 3, or 4 laps down already at that point, but was certainly they were not jockeying for position. I think it's clear to say there.
Yeah, no. And so you've got 2 instances already, right? You've got the start of the race drifting down where you probably should have just kept yourself and held your position in the high line and let things file out. There was a caution shortly after, like going into turn 1, obviously. So that didn't become a big deal. The tap on the wall with the right rear was a little bit of a big deal because you're running by yourself. And then just 3 laps later, you find yourself in a really tight battle with a rookie on an oval who probably had, certainly you could make an argument that the positioning of that car on the opening lap where Foster was, that created a unique scenario where it was, 3 wide, a lot of movement at the start. I'm not going to attribute blame on that, but I'll just say because that's just a cluster situation. But there were some questionable situations Foster was in on Sunday. And so if you're Malukas, why are you going to run that close with a guy like that? I understand, yes, Foster 100% should have backed out of the throttle, followed suit. That's nice driver protocol. That's the appropriate thing to do in many cases. But equally, if you are second place in a car that's capable of winning this race, and you started second at Milwaukee too, and you didn't take advantage of that, you fell backwards from that, which I think he tapped the wall there too, if I recall. You're just putting yourself in situations that you're not going to be able to get out of. And maybe that's just the pressure of I got to catch this guy, I got to win. But there wasn't a whole lot of room left. It doesn't help whenever that guy's moving up. It's just know your competition, know who you are racing around, know who you are racing with. Can you run Josef Newgarden that close and get away with it? Yeah. Can you run certain other people that close and get away with it? Yeah. But you don't know what you don't know. I mean, maybe it's just a lesson learned, but unfortunately it was a very hard lesson because, as we know, he ended up getting out of the car very gingerly, very slowly. Obviously, a lot of people might have been worried about the wrist situation given his history, and then later transported via helicopter to a nearby hospital just to kind of get an evaluation checkup on things. Obviously he's since gone to social media and shared that he's fine, appreciated the well wishes, etc. But those are instances, those are moments where I look at that and think to myself, this is the guy that's a really good driver, an incredibly quick driver, but I need to see something more complete before he is ready for a seat at the Penske table. But having said all that, that's what we got. That's just my 2 cents. It's nothing to take away from how talented I think he is. It's just there's certain subtle moments that leave me a little hesitant to think what he's ready for in the next step.
Yeah. So I looked, I looked at and maybe wondered about that scenario, maybe just slightly different. I wondered, I haven't gotten clarity on this, and if maybe after Louis' move, kind of forcing David to run really, really high, if he was ultimately pushed onto a line where he wasn't going to make the corner unless he dove down and took that bottom lane right when he did. And I wonder if that was in some ways not a panic move. I don't want to use that word, but just kind of a move where he felt like the way in which I've been pushed up, the only situation where I'm going to be able to make this corner is if I get back down. And so ultimately that was a business decision on his part where he felt like there was 100% chance he ends up in the wall if he doesn't get down there. And whether or not he makes it through the corner by diving down comes down to whether Louis is, able to get out of the gas and ultimately hand that position over. That's not the decision Louis made, and ultimately they collide. And unfortunately, David ends up in the wall there. I guess the thing I wonder too is, maybe if you're David and you're starting to realize as you're getting past the start finish line and you're getting close to turn one, do I have enough time to try and swing around the outside and make this move, or am I close enough to where, no, let me just tuck in, let's get through turns 1 and 2, and then on the back stretch I can pass Louis up and we can get this taken care of on a straightaway, rather than that just kind of a weird segment of the course where you got the dog leg. It's a unique course, a unique oval shape. Ultimately, we don't know how any more of that goes, but
you know what I harp on this though? Like, part of the
yeah.
reason I'm so critical about this is this. When you look at this, it's lap 83 of a 225 lap race, and you could have easily, if you're Malukas and he's making that move, I know that it's not the great thing to do, but if you're going to have a guy that's going to race you that way, then maybe you've got to burp the throttle a minute and realize we're only on lap 83. Like, Scott Dixon probably burps the throttle and gets him behind, and then figures out a way to take it another lap later or something like that. Because here's the other thing. It was lap 127. We talked about lap 83 is this Malukas incident where he crashed into the fence. Lap 127 was when Pato O'Ward, race leader, has a tire go down. If you follow suit and you just handle things in accordance, you never know what might strike. And in this case, you could have ended up, hindsight's 20/20, of course, but you could have ended up in a situation where you're de facto leader. And, if Louis is in front of you and he gets his lap back, cool. Guess what? You don't have to deal with him for a little while, not until you're trying to go back and be the leader and chase back markers again. So, and maybe there's a different racing cadence that happens with that because you've already raced against them a little bit there. So it was way too early to race like that. Plain and simple. It was way too early from Louis' side. It was way too early from Malukas' side. And Malukas had more to lose in that situation, and he did.
Yep. The one topic on this race I want to get to before we switch gears to kind of look at how this championship finished up for folks past first and second place. Josef Newgarden had some really interesting comments after the race. I mean, even talking to him on Saturday after qualifying in a kind of the small group scrum situation that we have when we have drivers qualifying on ovals, where we have an opportunity to talk to all of them when they're out of the car for a couple of minutes. Josef said he was not necessarily looking forward to the season being over, but it was very clear, the exhaustion that he had, being the guy having his home race. He had lots of fan appearances and availabilities to make the most of being in the town of Nashville, where he grew up just outside of in Hendersonville, I believe. He's talked before about how busy those Nashville race weekends have been, particularly when it was on the street course in downtown Nashville. And this one was no different. But I think when you couple that with the fact that it was falling on the finale, and you look at the season that Josef has had and the way in which we've been able to just kind of, see his attitude and his emotions change a little bit, and be able to tell just how tiring and trying the season was for him. Those emotions really came out in some of his answers in the post-race press conference. He spoke about, when someone asked him about going into this offseason and kind of what mindset he approaches these 6 months being largely out of race car with, he said he's looking forward to, he just wanted to go home. He's looking forward to getting away. And he said, not a direct quote, but essentially, I want to get to a point where I can miss this sport again. And that, I think, gives you a window into what Josef's been dealing with behind the scenes this year. And kind of, maybe, I don't know if he would entirely say he fell out of love with IndyCar, but from that quote, that tells me he's not going to miss it for the next little bit. He's going to very much enjoy getting away. And he, in some ways, to get back ready for 2026, first, he's going to need some distance from IndyCar before he can attack and approach his quest in 2026 of getting back into winning a handful of races and trying to go win another Indy 500 and ultimately putting together a consistent top level year, enough race to race where he can contend for a championship, which we haven't seen out of him since the end of 2022. And so those were some really, I felt like, revealing quotes from Josef, really the first time where we've gotten a chance to talk to him in depth in quite some time. He was on the podium at race 1 at Iowa, but that was a situation where he was he's pretty short on a lot of his answers because he was so frustrated about feeling like he should have won that race, if not for the way in which the closing laps had worked out, where Pato got a jump on an undercut and was able to run his in and out laps quick enough to where he could jump ahead of Josef in that pit sequence. So I asked Josef kind of a related question on, Josef, we've seen you go into off seasons and use those times to change the way in which you approach being a race car driver, both in and out of the cockpit. He went into this mode of being this very public, seemingly extroverted guy with the social media content that he did with Scott McLaughlin and Bus Bros. And then there was a time for that ahead of the 2024 season where Josef felt like he needed to scale back what he was doing outside of the race car. And he, I don't want to say ended that friendship. I don't want to speak for him, but certainly had the feeling of all of a sudden he and Scott were strictly teammates and teammates only. They were not shooting Bus Bros content anymore. Josef was, he unfollowed everyone on social media and certainly gave the appearance of being very offline and just kind of having some sort of tunnel vision where he's always been a fierce, focused, driven guy and kind of just honed in his focus that much more, and where it was just all about the things in the race car. And it doesn't necessarily seem like that is changing in a way, but maybe the way in which it might change a little bit is he's going to actually take some time to get away and refresh and recharge this off season, which there's certainly enough time to do with the 6 months that we have before we have cars back on track for a practice at St. Pete. But that was one thing where I felt like we finally got to look under the hood just a little bit with Josef, and I thought we heard some interesting things. He is, as I mentioned before, didn't really feel like this win was something that changes his outlook on the season. Felt like they had this car the whole time, and finally the team executed. Even though we did see a really cool kind of release of emotion in the way in which he celebrated at the end of the race when he drove it up to the outer wall and did his Indy 500 way in which he climbs through the fence and goes and interacts with the fans. You could tell in his interview with Georgia Henneberry there on the track that was, again, maybe not Indy 500 level exuberance, but certainly something that in that moment at least meant a lot to Josef.
Yeah, and I've kind of wondered this. I don't know if I've ever said this on the podcast throughout the season. Certainly, maybe there's aspects where you and I've talked about it off pod. The way in which this year has gone, and we know that last year he was in he negotiated a new deal. He was exploring options, but ultimately decided to re-up with Penske. When you think about the way this year's played out, there's some people that he was especially close with that aren't with the company anymore, right? Like I think of Tim Cedric, who, president of the IndyCar operations, was president of the whole thing prior to the push to pass scandal situation. And, after the latest penalty situation related to the attenuator stuff that got found out this past year in May, Tim, his strategist, got let go. And between that and all of the things that have transpired, it didn't look like Josef was having very much fun. And the thought creeped in my mind, and just the way that everything has kind of played out, it kind of gave off a vibe like, is there a situation where maybe Josef takes a hiatus, like takes a brief, maybe permanent, retirement or what have you, or maybe decides like, look, I want to go try
a sabbatical, if you will.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Just something to just kind of like refresh and start to enjoy racing again, because it hasn't looked like he's had a whole lot of fun at all. And it hasn't looked like it's been a lot of fun for a while. Like even through the Indy 500 glory that he's experienced, I don't know if that comes with just an expectation of the competitiveness that like I have to win, but you know, he wears the negativity or the bad finishes or whatever you want to assimilate it to. He wears that a lot more than he carries the good. Like you see that. And, I mean, a lot of drivers will say, well, I can tell you which races I've lost more than I can tell you what I've won. But when you see the ones that he's won, frankly, let's be fair, there's probably not been another driver in the series over the last 2 years, and certainly throughout the tenure that he's been with Penske. And you think about, yes, the 2 championships, you think about the 3 runner-up finishes that he had that had to just be, I mean, that's legacy defining, right? I mean, that 5 championships looks a hell of a lot better on a resume than 2. And, and some of those head-to-head battles with Scott Dixon there. And there's not another driver that's probably been as under the microscope and scrutinized and as carefully examined as Josef has. And a lot of that comes with the fact that like he's supposed to be the new face of American open wheel racing. Like that's what he came in at Penske with, and he started off with a bang, and it's kind of fizzled out, and then it rose a little bit with the Indy 500s. And the road course performances haven't been there when they used to be there. It's strictly the oval prowess now, and and all of this other stuff with the scandals. So anyway, long-winded way to say, I kind of wondered if a sabbatical would have been on the table, and certainly with what you're describing with the post-race interviews and stuff, the fact that he's giving the indication of like, I got to miss this again. Like, if you're not missing it, you're probably not having a whole lot of fun.
Yeah, there were a not insignificant number of folks within the paddock who, proposed the question or really actually thought was going to happen. Like we were going to arrive on Monday or Tuesday and find that Josef was retiring. Ultimately, that didn't come to pass. There are also some. Yeah, that's true. We still got 5 months and the better part of 3 or 4 weeks before this is all before we get back to the 2026 season. But there's also a lot unknown or things that are unclear as to the length of his contract at Team Penske. He signed an extension that got announced either in late May or early June of last year when we were at Detroit. Last year was the last year of a deal for him, and so they announced that extension. There are some people in the paddock, depending on who you talk to, some people think it might have just been a 2-year extension. From what I understand, Team Penske's longer term deals are typically 3-year, rolling contracts. And if you, had a great run, you just, sign another 3-year one. That seems to be what I think I understand. So I don't know if Josef is in a place where he could leave as soon as next year. I know Will Buxton put out there on social media that there are a lot of people that think that his seat could very much become available after the end of next season. And that would indicate he either has just a 2-year deal that could end after next year, or there's some people that you talk to in the paddock too that think after the way in which he has struggled in championships these last few years since he had his 3 straight runner-up finishes from 2020 to 2022, and the leadership changes that have changed there, where he no longer has Tim Cindric, which many people in the paddock viewed Tim as the best strategist in the business. And now with Tim no longer there and just kind of some uncertainty on what the leadership role is there, this team kind of being in a an evolution phase, and not having its feet underneath it when you see, its cars finish ninth, 10th, and 12th in the championship, I think, this year. There are some people in the paddock that wonder either if Joseph's contract ends after the end of next year, or if he actually goes and tries to force his way out. That would be something that I imagine would get fairly contentious with Roger Penske if that was really the case. But we'll see ultimately when silly season gets rolling next year if Josef or Joseph's seat, more importantly, are ones that are available. But until then, you hope that Josef gets the distance and the space that he needs to get back in the right headspace, spend time with family, his wife Ashley and his son Coda, and just recharge, because the sport ultimately is better with Josef Newgarden fighting at the front, and being honest and open in the good and the bad, and being a contender in championships, because that run that we had where he won a championship in 17 and then again in 19 and then was right in the running for 3 straight years, even though he ultimately didn't win in 20 through 22. Those are great battles, because when Josef Newgarden's at the top of the sport and he is a hunter, that's a tough position for the hunted to be in, without a doubt.
No, absolutely, facts. I want to make sure that we before we move on to the final segment, we gotta do this brief middle part to talk a little bit about the championship standings. I mean, obviously, coming into Nashville, we knew that Alex Palou had locked this thing up and Pato had locked up second. The race for third was on. That was still on the table. And how this ultimately played out, I'm going to do a quick read through of the championship standings, probably down through the 12th. So we got Dixon in third, Kirkwood in fourth, Lundgaard taking fifth for 2 Arrow McLaren guys to finish in top 5. Felix Rosenqvist sixth, Colton Herta seventh, Marcus Armstrong eighth, Will Power, Scott McLaughlin 9th and 10th, David Malukas 11th, Josef Newgarden 12th. So, you look at that, and just on the outside looking in for the hell of it, Christian Rasmussen, Rinus VeeKay, and Alexander Rossi. So there was a space here that was kind of unique. That battle third through sixth really was kind of interesting to me. And then obviously you look at the back end of that. At one point you could argue, like, if David Malukas goes and finishes second in this race or first, like he's probably bouncing out a Penske driver, and AJ Foyt's got 2 guys in the top 10 in back-to-back years after Ferrucci did what he did last year. Obviously it didn't materialize that way, but these are some really strong seasons that show growth out of Kyle Kirkwood and Christian Lundgaard and Felix Rosenqvist in particular. Just as you look through these championship standings, it was a distant 711 points for Alex Palou, while Pato had 515, and then Dixon had 452. So very big gaps at the top. But when you start to look at the middle of this pack, what do you kind of take from the championship so far?
Yeah, I'll just hit a couple things that stick out to me. Scott Dixon finishing third. We spoke to him. A small group of us spoke to him on Friday ahead of the race weekend. He told us, when we were asking him, whether this fight for third ultimately mattered or not, he entered the weekend sitting third and ultimately kept it. He finishes 12th on Sunday. Kyle Kirkwood and Christian Lundgaard both could have passed him with the right weekends. Christian was sitting fourth. Kyle was back in fifth, and ultimately they swapped spots. Dixon, as you mentioned, finished with 452 points. Kirkwood with 433, Christian with 431. Scott really felt like this had been another kind of ho-hum year for him and his group, and was really kind of amazed that they were still in a position where they could finish third, and felt like in some ways that was more a testament to the struggles of some other folks, that being, as you would assume, the 3 Team Penske drivers. Maybe along with some of the ups and downs that Andretti Global experienced. Ultimately, Kyle Kirkwood wins 3 races. Scott Dixon only wins 1, and Dixon still finishes 19 points ahead in the championship. So that stood out to me, that Dixon really kind of had a lackluster year with that 1 win, just 2 other podiums, finishes the year 11th, 9th, 12th, and still is able to hold on to third place. That was interesting to me. I thought it would have been a really incredible feat if Christian Lundgaard could have finished third, and ultimately you got two Air McLaren drivers in the top three, and you're going into an offseason where, yes, Alex Palou won this championship by 196 points. But if you're Air McLaren and you feel like a handful of opportunities got away from you, and yet you still have the second and third ranked drivers in the championship, that's got to feel good. Not that Christian finishing fifth which is a career high for him, and just being 21 points out of third, that's it's still solid. And ultimately, I think he probably he finishes 25th with a mechanical failure. He was running pretty solidly that day. I think he could have been squarely in the top 10. And ultimately, if he's 10th, then not only does maybe Dixon drop down a spot, but he gains 15 points. And if he's able to even climb up a couple more, maybe he's finishing third instead of Scott. So those were interesting. I thought it was also interesting to note that after Marcus Armstrong had overtook his teammate Felix Rosenqvist in the championship, ultimately it is Felix who finishes ahead. Armstrong with kind of a bummer of a finish to the year, down in 19th. Felix with a 7th place finish, had a really strong start to this year. And again, another season where it wasn't quite as rocky to end the year as it had been the year before. And ultimately the fact that it wasn't as part of why he's able to finish 6th, but still maybe not quite the back half of the year that Felix wants. And yet he finishes 6th with that season high mark in a runner-up finish at Road America. He's actually tied in points with Colton Herta. Colton Herta, again, still needed 5th place plus an FP1 to be able to gain a super license for this year, which ultimately doesn't matter with the approach that they have taken to his his future. He finishes tied with Felix in 7th. Marcus is in 8th. You've got this really interesting Penske related sandwich between Will Power and who beat Scott McLaughlin by a single point. We talked so much to closing down this year as Power was fighting for his future at Team Penske about how he was the top scoring Team Penske driver, and ultimately he's 1 point away from no longer being that. Scott finishes the year really with I feel like maybe some of the most momentum, even though Josef won the season finale. Scott finishes after back-to-back DNFs at race 2 at Iowa and Toronto, goes 10th, 7th, 3rd. So got to think that he, as tough of his year as it was, finishes kind of on a high note. David Malukas in 11th, just 2 points ahead of Josef Newgarden. And then as you mentioned, you start getting down into 13th with Christian Rasmussen. That's a guy who won a race this year. You don't always see your 13th place driver, someone who wins a race, who still is in 13th, and also someone who's 13th in your championship, able to win a race. Things like that, I think, really showed the depth of this championship. Rinus VeeKay, again, with not nearly the end to the year that they would have hoped in 23rd, 17th, 15th, and 13th, but did have that podium at Toronto, and we'll see where he ends up. And Alexander Rossi, we're certainly not used to seeing him down in 15th, but some high points for his first year at ECR. Ultimately, that team's going to want to see more of those, less of those finishes, from 11th to 17th, which he had just a little bit too many of. Frankly, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 finishes in between there. So nearly half his season, but did have 2 top 5s in his last 3 starts to the year, and also finishes the year in 10th, leading some laps. I think it's notable that Santino Ferrucci dropped down to 16th as after finishing 9th in the championship last year. I think Kiffin Simpson had enough high marks that in finishing 17th that we should expect a pretty big step for him next year. I think he's someone who absolutely could finish in that 10th to 13th spot in points. I think with how deep this field is, that would be really respectable from him. And then Connor Daly, not a bunch to write home about, but finishing 18th in this 27 car field is not something to completely overlook when it's a team that is still really trying to get its footing underneath it in Juncos Hollinger Racing, and he has ultimately 4 top 10 finishes, including a 5th place finish to end the season off. Ultimately, if Connor is able to stick in that ride, you do still feel like there is some sort of a platform that team can work off of, and they ultimately just need to see more of those, some maybe even better finishes on ovals, and also lift the floor up on road and street courses if they are back together in 2026.
Yeah, and I guess for me, you covered everything pretty well there. I'm looking a little bit below that line of where we were, and I'm looking at Marcus Ericsson in 20th, Callum Ilott in 21st, and Nolan Siegel in 22nd, Louis Foster in 23rd. All three, or all four, I should say. Can't count, can't math. I'm a writer. When you look at this, it's good and bad for different reasons. I think with Marcus Ericsson, there's flashes of moments, and it's just a matter of having those more consistently. Obviously, had a lot of bad luck, and I think by now, assuming that nothing changes, assuming that everything moves forward as it is in accordance and as expected, frankly, because I think maybe a little bit too much was made of it in the middle of the year, but you and I kind of had a little bit more faith that this was going to just be a continued commitment for them going into 2026. I think by now we know that 2026 is make or break for Andretti and Marcus Ericsson to get some good results out of this. Callum Ilott with that Prema group to string off 4 top 10 finishes in the last 5 races is phenomenal by that group, and it really speaks to the growth out of the team, but also speaks to the fact that Callum Ilott is still one of the more underrated talents. That as we all know, if he was in a ride on the same level of some of these guys at the front in the top 10, I've got zero doubt he'd be up there battling with them. And obviously Nolan Siegel, he didn't start one of the races at Iowa after the crash. I kind of look at him and Marcus Ericsson in a similar way. I think next year is going to be a very critical year for Nolan Siegel. And then Louis Foster, 23rd Rookie of the Year, in kind of a unique way after Robert Schwartzman kind of shoots himself in the foot a little bit there in Nashville. He had it all to play for, and as they say, kind of wet the bed a little bit. Good on Louis for being an Indy Next champion that comes in and wins Rookie of the Year. That's what you're expected to do. I'd be very curious what we see out of that team as it moves forward with Jay Fry having a full year at the helm going into 2026. Not even a full year because he didn't start till April. So 8 months at the helm or 10 months at the helm once the season finally starts. So, and with that, it's a good way to segue into the next one of when 2026 season starts. We know we'll be in St. Pete, but we know that as the season goes on, the one part of this week, and for those that listen and check out the silly season episode, we didn't necessarily talk about tracks and schedules. We wanted to address that here. While there's been some driver movement already in the market, some 4 days after the season's ended, there's been one track announcement, and we're staying in the Toronto area, but IndyCar is going to be racing in Markham. I guess I read that James Hinchcliffe is from Markham, what have you. It's a 5-year deal. I don't know jack about Markham, to be honest with you. Tony Kottman is designing the street layout. I've seen the rendering of the layout itself, and it looks kind of cool and unique, and there's elements of it that kind of remind me of Belle Isle in a weird way from just the layout perspective, which I'm trying to hold out an opinion of being hypercritical about it. I don't care about the track as much as I care about the area. To go into Toronto and knowing you were racing at Exhibition Place, we know why it's not possible next year with the World Cup, but this is a 5-year commitment now. And there's some other stuff to get into from the schedule perspective that are speculative at this point that have yet to be announced, but this has been announced. So, what's your takeaway with Toronto?
I I understand why we got to this point. Again, as you said, the scheduling around the World Cup, and then also the follow up with what's called the Canadian National Exhibition that is held in the back half of August every year as a big mega state fair like event that is held for the better part of 2 weeks. It just made racing an exhibition place for IndyCar in 2026 impossible. So if you are Green Savoree, the folks that promote this race, and you are looking for a way in which IndyCar can stay in what I think is a really important market for the sport, particularly when it comes to sponsors and a segment of your fan base that really shouldn't be overlooked. Ultimately, they land racing in a suburb of Toronto. It is about 20 miles northeast of Toronto. It's depending on the time of day, I think 30 to 40-minute drive. There is some capability of getting out there via public transit, which is good. You like to see that. I thought it was interesting, and also another thing that makes sense, but also I think really signals IndyCar's near future end in racing in Toronto. This is a deal that's 5 years. You would imagine that it had to be of that length because the city is going through a lot to be able to host this race next year, and they didn't want to pull out all the stops to have this then just be a one and done thing and be a guaranteed one and done thing from the start. So this required a long-term commitment from Green Savoree Racing and IndyCar's perspective. And so ultimately the way in which the World Cup falls ultimately kind of signals the end to what next year was going to be the 40th race for American Open Wheel Racing in at Exhibition Place. You'd always heard some rumblings over the last couple of years as these had continued to just be one-year deals about whether this race would continue, whether the local government around there was really a big fan of hosting a big motor race downtown. You continue to have development around the site, around the race track site, and kind of encroaching on the space to the point where you have this really wonky pit lane. It's a really short track. Still, I think a great way in which to reach people. And IndyCar, Penske Entertainment president and CEO Mark Miles has talked the last couple of years about the importance of reaching people where they're at and bringing the racing to them and holding big events that feel like they matter, that fans want to go to. And I know why we had to leave Toronto, but I think there is some element of this where there are folks that say it is easier to get to Markham than it is to get to downtown Toronto, and what the traffic is like there and what the hotel prices cost. And I can understand that. And there are also folks that say you are taking this 45 minutes outside downtown. Why do you think people who live in downtown Toronto are going to come and watch this race? And we've seen some elements of that over the lack of fans that we saw at Texas Motor Speedway when that's so far away from the area around Dallas and Fort Worth. And again, that race had other issues. That's not necessarily a direct connection there, but Nashville didn't have the most amazing crowd. That's again a track that is about in Lebanon, Tennessee. That's about 45 minutes away from downtown Nashville. I'm trying to think of some other similarities to that. Ultimately, this feels like the best way that you could still hold a race there next year. I don't know that I feel confident enough to say that this is going to be the best thing for this event long term, but ultimately, if this is what you needed to do to preserve it, to be able to continue racing in the Toronto area, then maybe this is making the best of a bad scenario or a bad situation. And I guess maybe we're still lucky to continue see racing in the greater Toronto area and not leave that segment of the fan base completely without a race.
It does. Well, I'm trying my best not to hold out. I'm going to hold out criticism as far as the race itself and the track and what the atmosphere could be like, because I don't know what restaurants and things that place has to offer that maybe make it more appealing to the fans that come out. So I can't speak to that because I'm not familiar with it. But what I will say is to your point, to move from Exhibition Place to here, there's a certain feeling, and there's some elements that kind of feel like Portland in a way, being next to the track and Green Savoree being part of it. And it kind of feels like it's in the desolate part of Toronto, whereas it's kind of the desolate part of Portland is where Portland International Raceway is. If with this being a 5-year contract, a 5-year deal, what it tells me, and the reason why there's a little bit of an irkness or a red flag to it is that tells me that there needs to be, this is 5 years to get something together to actually make things happen for proper racing in Canada. You cannot lose racing in Canada, period. I don't care if it's Toronto, Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Winnipeg. I think personally we should be racing in Canada twice.
Yes, agreed.
One on the Northeast and maybe Vancouver in a new laid out street race. I personally would like to get away from Portland. I hate that place, but this gives 5 years for the leadership at Penske Entertainment and obviously Fox Sports now being involved to play around with some different ideas to figure out. I mean, whether that's maybe it's a Mossport, maybe it's a permanent facility and not necessarily a street layout. So, but certainly we need a race in Canada, and so I think this gives a little bit of a scramble drill. It does feel like the best of a worst case scenario in terms of making sure that you're still getting funding from the city that's pushing to Green Savory Promotions to make sure that this thing can be put on. It had to stay obviously within the confines of the Toronto, Ontario area in order for that funding to happen. Otherwise, you're going through more permits and other paperwork and loopholes, and who knows how this gets hung up. So, so we'll see on that one. What this has.
It was. I'll tell you, it was really. There are some people that have done some really cool work over the last 24 hours since this got announced. Really jarring to see kind of the Google Earth views of what that area around the track actually is.
It's a bus lot.
It is not even necessarily like what the track is going to be as much as like it is a really uninspiring backdrop. I feel like it's going to be what I feel like now is it's, our street race events in IndyCar are supposed to feel like those ones where, you're in a big area, whether a really cool area to be, there's a lot going on, whether it's Long Beach or St. Pete or Detroit. Now Arlington coming on, downtown Toronto before, Nashville before it fell off the calendar. And it has this feeling of, racing in this suburb. And again, I haven't been in Markham, so I don't want to speak too much for it. I know it does have a much bigger population than what I would have guessed. I think I saw yesterday like 370,000 people. It is the most diverse city or community in Canada, so that's really cool. There's lots of tech and science businesses that either have their headquarters there or have buildings there, and so there's clearly a lot going on in Markham, but it just is not going to have those cool. I'll be interested to see what those like panning shots that we typically see at, Long Beach or St. Pete of the harbor, or what we would typically see in Nashville of the skyline there. I don't necessarily know what the trademark shot of the of this Markham street race is necessarily going to be, and so that might be one of these hurdles that this race could face. And it might be one of the situations where you've really got to bring in some entertainment elements to make this something that people want to come to, because there are some people where this is going to be closer for them because they don't live in downtown Toronto, but there are also going to be a lot of people in the Toronto area. They're going to need a reason to come, and it might not just be able to be because of the racing.
Yeah, no, for sure. So that's the one definite that we have in the calendar that has been newly announced this week. There's still, obviously, we still have an entire calendar to announce at some point. IndyCar's got to figure out some things with that, and there's still a few things we're tightening up. I wanted to touch on one or two small things, stuff that obviously we've talked about a few times in the last few episodes, but maybe this gives an opportunity to I guess, as we continue to learn and grow, maybe we get a chance to narrow this down a bit. So touching on a few key points, there's been obviously some of the talks about IndyCar and Phoenix and the time frame of that. Obviously, some of the stuff that's been pushed around is potentially teamed up with NASCAR again. You got to think Fox Sports is behind that effort to push that. And I know we touched on that in the most recent episode. That's yet to be confirmed, but certainly on the table. But one of the things that I'd come across yesterday was something from Adam Stern of the Sports Business Journal, talking to Eric Shanks in one of his stories, and it was mentioned, and it's something that you had brought up, and this just kind of felt like it furthered the point a little bit more on the most recent developments with things, and only because we haven't had a chance to kind of catch up and learn where this was until yesterday. But it looks like there could be a potential situation where all this stuff that you had mentioned in recent weeks, where the tug of war of momentum with Mexico being on the table could very well find itself kind of at an impasse for 2026. And in order to make up for that, I'd learned through that article that Washington, D.C. might be the trade-off. It's a hell of a choice, given some of what's played out this year, especially on social media, and also given the popularity we know of one Pato Award. How real, or do you get a sense that this is?
From talking to people in the paddock this weekend and some follow-up conversations that I've had over the last couple of days, I get the sense that this was kind of brought up in happenstance and not maybe something that like really had some real legs behind it initially. Props to Adam. Adam has been on top of this story since it came out. I think really like a week ago, almost exactly, if not a couple days more. That was, I'll be totally frank and honest, I had not heard a lick about DC until Adam's story a week and maybe a day or two ago. So maybe that tells you how early stages those conversations are and how much they've been rushed along. I do, though, get a sense that this has kind of come to the fore as a backstop option in case Mexico City doesn't happen. And Mexico City need to get that figured out within, I think, a couple days, or I don't think it's going to happen. There are some people around those discussions that feel, from conversations I have had, somewhat unconfident that is ultimately going to happen. And it has, I think I've done a lot of the reporting over the last month to 6 weeks about the back and forth and the way in which it has, kind of ping ponged on the confidence of whether it's going to happen or it's not going to happen, and the reasons why that is or isn't the case. And ultimately, it feels like this DC thing, for those who haven't seen, I believe that if IndyCar is running in DC, it's around the 4th of July weekend. And it is part of this event that has already been announced, where the UFC, the fighting league, and the Trump administration have kind of come together with President Donald Trump wanting to throw this big extravaganza celebration to celebrate the United States of America's 250th birthday next year in the summer, with 1776 to 2026 marks that 250 year mark for our country. And so there's going to already be this big UFC match somewhere, staged somewhere in downtown DC. And from what it sounds like, and from people I've talked about, it seems like there's a real possibility that IndyCar could get added to that card, if you will, and have the potential of running alongside it. I think, it could be a really neat opportunity. I think it is, something like this comes off as very much a one-off, kind of in the way in which maybe the San Diego event for NASCAR is kind of a one-off. I don't know. I mean, if it runs just really, really well and you have an unbelievable crowd and you think that you can extend that interest beyond just kind of the greater interest in people flocking to DC to celebrate the US's 250th birthday, maybe you run it back in 2027. But I would imagine that maybe this is kind of just like a one-off thing that would feel like it's very much in the realm of what Fox, when you hear some of these quotes around the recent addition to Fox in the Penske Entertainment Group with that one third equity sale of one of these like big, home run swing type things that they want to see that can put IndyCar on a big stage and help grow the sport. Things that happened earlier in this summer aside, I think it could be really cool. I also think if this comes in the wake of Mexico City not happening, I think it's kind of a bittersweet thing, because I think DC could be cool, but I mean, having another 12 months after what happened last year at Milwaukee to kind of get this Mexico City thing rolling again. Pato finishing second in the championship, and his fandom only continuing to grow both here and in Mexico, would be a lot of questions for Penske Entertainment to answer if indeed this does not happen. You would wish that maybe there's a situation where both things could be on the calendar. I don't know that there's necessarily enough room for it, and I don't know that the sport is quite in a good enough place where teams would be in favor of running an 18th race, especially if that 18th one, if you have it, is a trip down to Mexico City. So I think we should find out here within a week or so, potentially, what the schedule is, and if it is, we will hop on for another episode and break it all down for you and kind of parse it out. But that is where I know of things as of now. You mentioned Phoenix. I reported in my story last week that is indeed the expectation, that IndyCar will be racing on March 7th or 8th at Phoenix International Raceway, a track that they haven't raced at since 2018, that they left when they had been running solo, when the racing hadn't been super great and the fan turnout had frankly been even worse. I think there's a great opportunity for, if IndyCar stays running on that Saturday, either before or after the Xfinity race, I think there's a great opportunity for IndyCar just to be in front of a great crowd. I think that ticket to go to Phoenix and watch Xfinity, which a lot of people say is the more entertaining form of stock car racing compared to Cup nowadays. You can watch an Xfinity race and an IndyCar race at Phoenix. I think there should be a lot of great interest in that, and I think that could put on a better race than Phoenix has over the last couple of years. And I think certainly the fan turnout would be great. Ultimately, that would be something where you just hope to continue to be able to see more collaboration between IndyCar and NASCAR in the future. And Fox obviously plays a big part in that. And the other big part of that piece last week was the fact that Barber will fall in the last weekend of March. We learned that through another lower level single make sports car series that put out their schedule that announced that they were racing at Barber that weekend, and that they would be sharing the weekend with IndyCar. So if all of that does indeed play out like we expected to, that means 4 races for IndyCar within the first 5 weeks of the year, and 3 straight race weekends to open up 2026, which is needless to say quite a different way in which to start a year compared to the way in which we've seen IndyCar get to slow slogs to start the year with a lack of racing.
Yeah. Just a few points for me is one, obviously last time IndyCar was at Phoenix, the racing was very uninspiring for a multitude of different reasons. And I think that because of what has been found with the combination of the package for Gateway and for Milwaukee, I'm holding out a little bit of hope that we're going to see something similar at a place like Phoenix, which could be a lot of fun. So I've got some optimism for that. Then the other things are, I'm kind of shocked that the backup plan wouldn't be a Richmond or a Watkins Glen for a Mexico situation, a permanent facility that, frankly, you don't have to do too many different things. And having, since it's not confirmed yet, having 8 months, 9 months, 10 months to get everything in order to prep for a street race in a city you've never been to, that ratchets this thing up. I mean, keep in mind, we're talking about a year and a half and waiting for Arlington, and the fact that you're going to do that in essentially half the time to put together something for a DC race that could only be a one-off. Now, could it be a lot of fun? Absolutely. Could it be unique, and could there be more to it? Yeah, but there's so many questions there as far as who's promoting it, how's that going to work, Is Tony Cotman going to build this street course just like he has a hand in all the other ones, or is it going to have a completely different look to it? What are some of maybe the government loopholes that are different than usual because it's DC? So
I mean, racing around, if you're truly like in the hubbub of our nation's capital, like it's certainly going to be a lot more of a difficult thing to, have the proper safety restrictions, make sure that the president and Congress, like they're, whatever emergency routes that they have to have available in case of a worst case scenario for members of the government. Like I'm sure there's things that you have to factor in there. Like I'm sure planning a race in downtown DC, going around the monuments and museums and around or close to the White House or Congress, like that's got to be as difficult of a prospect as you can imagine in a street race that could actually happen. Obviously, racing in downtown New York City maybe a little bit different or difficult, but I have to think in terms of things that could possibly happen. Realistically, this has got to be the most difficult.
Yeah, and I mean the backdrop would be badass, but needless to say, though, here's my thoughts on this. And then again, nothing's been announced yet, and if it does get announced, I'm going to go. This will be an even more heightened rant, I guess you could say. But the fact that it's this far and we haven't got confirmation of Mexico is a huge red flag to me. And if Mexico doesn't happen for whatever reason, I don't care what the reason is. The momentum that was built into it and how much everything looked pretty much locked up, I want to say, like set. Everything seemed like it was pretty firmed up by earlier this year, and it was just a matter of ironing out a few subtle details. And the fact that those subtle details have extended this way, at least that's what we were made to believe. We don't know exactly how far apart or how close anything is, etc. But it would be a colossal failure on all fronts. Like I'm not going to just attribute blame to Penske Entertainment or the group that handles things for Hermanos Rodriguez, but at the end of the day, it'd be a colossal failure because IndyCar needs to be there, plain and simple. I know everything is so set at 17 races. I'm okay if we have 18 races or 20 races. I think the cap's 20. I think we get a little too bent out of shape about different things when we start the season, when we end the season, et cetera, like that. There's ways we could play with that. As we go on. I think with Fox, the sky's the limit in terms of like we could broadcast midweek races at this point and certain points of the year. But so there's ways to play with that. But I don't ever want to hear like, oh, well, this is we can't add it because it's just too much. Like we're ending the season into a 6-month off season. So that sucks in its own right. And, we got to figure out ways to kind of play around with that. We can't be so afraid of that, but that's a rant for another day. At the end of the day, we should just be in Mexico. And if we're not, shame on everyone for screwing that up.
100%. Well, we will wait with bated breath to see when the schedule finally materializes, and we will have another episode for you guys, listeners of the Inside Line. When it does, we'll break it all down and talk about why things ended up the way they did and what the schedule looks like, some of our favorite changes and aspects to it, and ultimately what to look for when it comes to 2026. We'll have, again, some more episodes of the Inside Line coming through this off season. Stay tuned for the timing on that. But until then, thanks for watching, listening. Like and subscribe. You can find us again on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, YouTube, IndyStar.com. We thank you guys for listening and supporting us and interacting on social media. Tell us what you like, what you don't like, what you want to see more of, what you have questions on, and we look forward to bringing you a lot more episodes of this as we get through this long off season. Again, that I'm sure we'll have some more twists and turns that we aren't even totally aware of, and as we look ahead to the 2026 IndyCar season. For now, this is Nathan Brown, Joey Barnes. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Inside Line.